Your approach to 2-5-1 progressions is probably wrong, and that's getting in the way of your solo sounding right. Now, a small part of this is what you play. It's really much more about how you think about the chords. And there are different strategies for this, which actually all work, even if they don't agree at all. I'll cover my approach, but also show you methods from Barry Harris, Pat Martino, and Joe Pass. Now, once I got my thinking on this right, then things really started to fall into place and my solos really started to make a lot more sense. And then you can actually take this a lot further than just the 2-5-1 progressions. Before we get into the different approaches and the wars between them, at least on the internet, then let's look at what a 2-5-1 is. The progression is described as a 2-5-1 because it's in a key, and the key is the 1 chord. Let's take C major, since that's an easy key, and look at how this works. Here you have the notes of the C major scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. And for each of these notes, you can build a 7th chord. C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G7, A minor 7, B half diminished, and C major 7. With these chords, called the diatonic chords of C major, you usually assign Roman numerals so that you know which key you're in and what this chord is relative to the key. Now you can pick out the 2-5-1. So you get D minor 7, G7, and C major 7. And you should of course play these chords. Maybe just play this short progression a few times to get the sound into your ears. You can use these voicings and then vary the rhythm a bit. Before we get into these different strategies, then you also need to just understand sort of basically how a jazz solo works. Try and listen to this. You can probably hear the chord changes in there, and then I'll explain how it works. The way I was doing that here is probably also the easiest way to play solo lines like that. And that is to use the same notes in the solo as there are in the chords. So that would be the arpeggios of those chords. And since the whole progression is in 1 key, in this case C major, then you want to think about those arpeggios as a part of the C major scale. So if we start with that scale, that would be this. And for the 2-5-1, then you have these simple 1-octave arpeggios. And of course, even though I'm going to take this further in just a few seconds, you want to practice playing licks with just those basic arpeggios, because they can sound really great. Something like this. And remember, when you work on this, use rhythm as well. But of course we can add more notes to the whole thing. And as you heard in the beginning, then the 2-5-1 is in a key. So the scale that fits with that key can also be used to give you some more notes to add into your solo lines. Visually, I think you want to think about the scale as the thing that contains all the notes. And then you can think about the arpeggios as being the important notes at that point in time. But you can use all of them. And you also want to notice how I'm not always using all the notes of the arpeggio. There's no rule that says that you have to play a complete arpeggio all the time. Until now, I only showed you how to find the right notes, but you also need to make the right types of melody to get the right flow in there, because just playing the right notes just won't cut it. I think this example speaks for itself, and this is about the most important thing about a 2-5-1. The problem with the previous example was not the notes. They're perfect, and also in terms of following the chords. Where it falls apart is that they don't connect and that there's no connection between the melodies per chord. But the 2-5-1 is not just 3 random chords next to each other. You can't just change the order and get the same result, which is a part of the reason that I don't really like sort of the modal description of Dorian, Mixolydian, Ionian, because if you only have that description, you could actually put together completely random chords. What makes this work is that there's a development and that the chords flow forward to end on that 1 chord. And the easiest way to get that flow in there is to play lines that move to the next chord. And that is actually not as abstract or difficult as it might sound. I think in general then this is probably the most important skill to learn in music. If you want the solo line to flow from 1 chord to the next, then the easiest strategy is simply to think ahead. Think of a note that you want to hit and then play a melody that ends on that. But you want to have the right target note, of course. I'll get to that in a bit. Moving from D minor to G7, then B is a good target note. And notice how especially the last part of the phrase really aims for that B on beat 1 of the G7 bar. Thinking ahead is such a useful skill when it comes to music in really a lot of ways. And in this case, being able to play phrases that connect chords like this is an essential skill, and also something that you will see in solos all over jazz. It's not the only thing to learn, but it is a really great place to start, especially if you want to solo over chord changes. When it comes to choosing target notes, then it makes sense to focus on sort of the really clear notes in the chord. And the third is a really good candidate. And you make it easier for yourself if you're choosing a target note that wasn't in the previous chord. Simply because then when you change and when you hit that target note, then there's a new note there, a sound that wasn't there, and you can easily hear that now the chord is changing. Which is also why I took B, which is the third in G7, but it isn't a chord tone in D minor 7. In my approach, I'm showing you how to spell out each chord in the 2-5-1, but there are other ways of negotiating this 3-chord building block, and I have my own possibly hot take on those as well. This often becomes a sensitive topic because you're inclined to follow one strategy and then really dislike the rest, but I'll talk about that in a bit as well. Now there are 3 chords in the 2-5-1, and no matter how you look at it, then the point of the progression is that something is moving, and finally then there's a resolution. So the 1 chord is going to be there in all versions of this, but how you choose to interpret the 2-5 side of the progression is a lot more open. You have Martino, who likes to convert chords into minor 7 chords, as he talks about here with giant steps.
Here I'm using an A flat minor 7th, which is, and then A minor 7th.
The way he would approach the 2-5-1, then he would sort of becomes a 2-1. So he'll play lines over the 2 chord and not really think too much about the 5 chord. He talks about how this was something that he learned from experience. There are passages in West solos that suggest that he very often thought in the same way as well. And that may very well be where Martino got it, since he was very influenced by West. The advantage is that there are fewer chords. The disadvantage is that you're not playing 5-1, which is probably the strongest part of what is happening. And the 2 chord, I think, is really just a suspension of that 5 chord. Barry Harris and Joe Pass do the opposite of this, as you probably heard in this clip.
I'll tell you. If I have a 2-5, forget the 2. You don't need it.
In this approach, the 2 chord is ignored and you focus on the 5-1 resolution, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the strongest movement in the 2-5-1. Both Barry Harris and Joe Pass talk about this, where Joe is maybe a bit more practical in his explanation. And this is also something that you'll see in a lot of solos of Charlie Parker. So it's pretty clear where it came from. Again, it's great to have fewer chords, but as I've also said quite often, there are no rules in music, so if you treat this as a rule, then sometimes it does become a little bit strange. If you have a secondary dominant leading into the 2 chord, so let's say that you're playing over an A7 that resolves to D minor 7, G7, and then all the way to C major 7, then if you're only thinking about the G7, then you have to learn how to play A7 flat 9 into G7, which is maybe not the most natural thing to learn, and also not what is really there or what you hear in the music. So my take on this, which will certainly be a hot take for some, is that the strongest of the 2 is probably Barry Harris. But in my experience, then you want to be able to play all 3, simply because it's going to give you more options and also connect better with the music so that you hear the harmony and you play over what you hear. But only focusing on one of the chords in the 2-5 can actually be great. And it's a great way to get inspiration for other melodies. So it is incredibly useful to play, for instance, D minor 7 to C major 7 like this. Or of course, just thinking G7 and then play a line like this. If you can play all 3 chords, then you can also easily choose to only play 2 of them. And with target notes, it's fairly easy to get from one chord to the next, regardless of what chord it is. That is in fact one of the strengths of that system. But I'm sure you'll let me know if this makes you angry in the comments. The most important thing, at least to me, is the melodies that you're playing. It's much more important than what chords you're thinking about, and you want to focus on that aspect of learning to play jazz, so that your solos flow through the chords but also have the right feel and the right sound. And that is not so much about finding the magic scale that will solve all your problems, but much more about what you do with the material that you have. And that is what makes people like George Benson and Wes Montgomery so amazing. You need to develop your basics for jazz lines so that your solos sound better. And I cover some of the strongest concepts in this video.